During this time that fever was starting to bubble up, Vito began to take on more responsibility at the street level, earning greater respect despite the personal damage inflicted by his wife's public accusations. Vito was a ruthless enforcer, a veteran of the Prohibition era, and a powerhouse with considerable influence. Frank Costello, ever the diplomat, tried to support his friend and teach Vito that, to rise to the top, he needed allies like Costello. But Vito's greed and spitefulness remained unchecked. Vito harbored deep anger and resentment over the disrespect he felt from Luciano and Costello. While Costello continued to wine and dine with the elite, his respect on the streets began to wane. Unlike the other mobsters who had mistresses, Charlie remained loyal to his wife, Igea Lissoni, never cheating on her, even though their marriage was short. Costello, on the other hand, was spending lavishly on his mistress, so much so that, according to Charlie Luciano, one mistress could have traveled the world twice over with the money he gave her. Despite their differences, Vito was far more feared than Costello. In 1957, Vito finally made his move. Frank Costello was shot, the bullet grazing his head and narrowly missing him, saved by sheer luck. Vito's ruthless ambition had taken him to the brink, and the balance of power in the underworld was about to shift. This article was printed in 1957, right after the shooting. Frank Costello is wounded from ambush in New York. By Ray Cohn. Frank Costello was slightly wounded Thursday in what police described as an apparent assassination attempt. The 65-year-old Costello was fired upon at almost direct range by a gunman as he entered his Central Park West apartment building. After the gunshot nicked his scalp, Costello, often called the #1 mystery man of the American underworld and political scene, cried out in his raspy voice, "Somebody tried to get me." Later, Costello told reporters, "I don't know why I was shot. They must have mistaken me for somebody else. I'm glad it wasn't any worse." The bullet struck Costello on the left ear, furrowed under the scalp partway around the back of his head, and emerged by the right ear. Later, in the apartment house lobby, police found what appeared to be a .32 caliber bullet. Wound superficial blood flowing from his wound, Costello was taken by taxicab to nearby Roosevelt Hospital. X-rays disclosed no damage to the skull. Treated for the wound, he was then escorted to a police station for questioning. It was nearly dawn before Costello, accompanied by an attorney and 2 police detectives, returned to his home. The shooting occurred at about 11 at night, shortly after Costello arrived by car at his residence, accompanied by William Kennedy, a theatrical producer. The pair had just left Costello's wife Estelle and Generoso Pope, the owner of an Italian-language newspaper, at an Upper East Side restaurant. Pete Keith, the doorman of the plush apartment house, said Costello was just leaving his car and entering the building when a black sedan pulled up at the curb. Keith said a heavy-set man, about 6 feet tall, rushed by him into the lobby. The gunman fired from about 15 feet away from Costello, the doorman said, then dashed past him to the black sedan, which sped away from the scene. Costello testified in 1951 during the televised hearings of the Kefauver Committee on Organized Crime. All-out war was now on the brink between the Genovese and Costello factions. Something had to be done. Luciano, furious and screaming bloody murder from Italy, was increasingly limited in his ability to communicate. Gambino and others sent emissaries to speak with both sides, with Genovese dispatching figures like Tommy Eboli and Mike Miranda to engage in peace talks. Luciano respected Mike Miranda and had a calm discussion with him, but when Tommy Eboli visited, the conversation turned heated. It was at that moment Luciano realized his grip on power was slipping. Desperate, Luciano sent word to trusted allies, using the Gambino family to reach out to Anastasia, calling for a sit-down and a commission vote on ordering a hit on Vito Genovese. However, Carlo Gambino, head of the Gambino family, had no interest in such a move. When Gambino's brother visited Luciano and relayed the message, Carlo Gambino stopped it in its tracks. It never reached Anastasia, or if it did, Anastasia chose to ignore it and pursue his own agenda against Vito. After Anastasia's murder on October 25, 1957, Luciano began to piece together what had happened. He started to suspect that it was Carlo Gambino who had been pulling the strings all along, manipulating events, ordering hits, and maneuvering to climb to the top. But what could Luciano do at that point? Despite his growing resentment, Luciano's focus remained on Vito, not Gambino. He recognized Gambino's strategic moves as the same kind of calculated chess plays he had once made against Masseria and Maranzano. Luciano understood the rules. You live by the gun, you die by the gun. It was now time to acknowledge Gambino's position in the game, even as his own influence waned. The next day, an article was printed about the hit on Albert Anastasia. It did not dwell much on how he was killed, but focused more on how he lived, ending with that famous quote that summed it all up. Mobster met his end by the gun. He lived by Dick Mathieu. Albert Anastasia, who climbed to the top of the underworld over the bodies of more than 30 victims, was born Umberto Anastasio, 55 years ago, in the fishing village of Tropea, in the poverty-stricken province of Calabria, in the south of Italy. His father was a railroad worker who spent his life struggling to feed his wife and 12 children. 4 of his 8 sons, Umberto, the most notorious of them, took to the sea in their early teens, brawled their way through the toughest ports of the world as deckhands, jumped ship in the US, and found unsavory niches for themselves on the New York waterfront. The others chose the path of respectability. One is the Reverend Salvatore Anastasia, pastor of St. Lucy's Church at 833 Mace Aves, Bronx. He has lived in obscurity, loved by the parishioners he serves humbly. Sneaked into US at 15. In 1917, at the age of 15, Umberto entered the US illegally in Brooklyn and went to work on the docks. Prohibition was just over the horizon. Easy money was in the air. Ruthless brawlers were in demand. Umberto, Americanizing his name to Albert Anastasia, soon found his place in the underworld. He became an enforcer for the racket lords of the waterfront. Anastasia's career almost ended in 1921, when he and another gunman were convicted of murdering George Terrell, a longshoreman. Sentenced to the chair. They were sentenced to death and sent to Sing Sing for electrocution the week of July 3, 1921. There were stays of execution. The conviction was reversed, and a new trial was ordered but never held. 4 key witnesses for the state vanished while Anastasia was in the death house. The indictment was dismissed, and Anastasia was freed on April 10, 1922. 3 months later, Anastasia was arrested on charges of killing one Carmelo Ferraro, 14 DeGraw Street, Brooklyn. The charge was dismissed. In again, out again. On April 9, 1923, he was arrested on a felonious assault charge. The complaint was dismissed. By this time, Anastasia had important friends in strategic places. Through an unexplained process, his fingerprints and photo negatives, taken on the 3rd arrest, were removed from the files. The murderous hoodlum got careless, however. On June 6, 1923, he was sent to the penitentiary for 2 years for carrying a loaded gun, one of the 2 times he was to serve behind bars. Jail did not bother him, although he admittedly did not like it. More futile arrests. But business was business, and his business was murder. There were more arrests, no convictions. The record went on to read this way: arrested August 13, 1928, on charges of shooting to death Carmine Centesime. Discharged August 16th. Arrested August 17, 1932, on charges of murdering John Bazzano with an ice pick. Discharged August 19th. Arrested August 19, 1932, on charges of consorting with known criminals. Discharged September 1st. Arrested August 10, 1933, on charges of homicide. Acquitted by a county court jury in Brooklyn. October 26th. Arrested October 21st, 1936, on a vagrancy charge. Discharged the following morning. Uncle Sam jugged him arrested March 10th, 1951, for failing to pay the government $250,000 in income taxes. On June 3, 1955, federal judge Thomas Madden in Camden, New Jersey, sent him to prison for a year and fined him $20,000, while a civil action was launched to collect the back taxes. Between arrests, Anastasia was a busy and rising gangster, highly regarded by the gang bosses. Back in the late 20s, he became a peer superintendent, a strategic job for running the dock rackets. He gained control of 6 locals of the International Longshoremen's Association, then affiliated with the AFL. Pal of top hoodlums. He made important connections with top mobsters, became an intimate of Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, Al Capone, the Moretti brothers, and Lucky Luciano. Prohibition ended in 1933. Wiser heads among the crime chiefs decided to organize a syndicate, apportion territories among their members, and work together instead of killing each other off as they had done during the days of so-called illegal booze. Heads Murder, Inc. But it was accepted that some characters would step out of line from time to time, and that an enforcement arm would be needed. The ruthless Anastasia was tagged to run the strong-arm squad. Abe, Kid Twist Reles, was appointed his top lieutenant, and, in time, spilled the apple cart. From 1932 until 1940, when Reles was grabbed and turned informer, 63 known murders for pay were committed by Murder Incorporated, of which Anastasia was the head. When Reles squealed, he said that Anastasia personally ordered 32 murders, including those of Pete Panto, an insurgent longshoreman who tried to fight the dock rackets, and Morris Moish Diamond, an ILA business agent who got out of line. Body dumped in lime pit Panto was shot to death in 1939, and his body dumped in a lime pit in Lyndhurst, New Jersey. Diamond was shot to death on a downtown Brooklyn street. William O'Dwyer, later to become New York's mayor, but in the early 40s the district attorney in Brooklyn, had what he considered a perfect case against Anastasia through Reles. He, said O'Dwyer of Anastasia, was entrusted with all the murders, official murders of theirs, committed by the Brooklyn group. No mob murder was committed in Brooklyn without Anastasia's permission and approval. Case out the window. But in November 1941, Reles plunged under unexplained circumstances 8 floors to his death from the room in the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island, where he was held in protective custody. O'Dwyer felt that his perfect case went out the window with Kid Twist. A Kings County grand jury that reviewed the case in 1945 held that the state, even with Reles' death, had enough proof to warrant Anastasia's indictment and conviction. However, no indictment was ever sought by O'Dwyer. A stateside soldier. In 1942, Anastasia found a perfect refuge from annoying police, the army. The war was on, and he went into service. He was assigned to the 8th Infantry Division at Camp Forest 10, an outfit that performed distinguished service overseas. Before the division shipped out, Albert was transferred to Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania, to teach troops how to work as longshoremen. Anastasia received his honorable discharge in 1944, due to age, as a tech sergeant. Became a citizen always one to figure the angles, he used his army service to obtain citizenship under a law favoring those in the armed forces. A later attempt by the US to revoke that citizenship on grounds that he had concealed a criminal record came to nothing. A civilian once more, Anastasia assumed a respectable business cloak. He became a partner in the Madison Dress Company, Hazleton, Pennsylvania, and made his home in a handsome $75,000 two-story Spanish ranch-type home at 75 Bluff Road, Fort Lee, New Jersey, overlooking the Hudson River, He played the family man role to the hilt, back in the rackets. But those aware accepted that he was in the rackets up to his armpits, the waterfront, trucking, labor, gambling, the numbers racket, the whole sweep. Anastasia, always under bodyguard, continued to live the life of the criminal big shot, showing up in Florida, in Hot Springs, Arkansas, at racetracks around the country. A known murderer getting away with murder because authorities could not find witnesses who would testify to his crimes. Anastasia's end came as one might have expected. He lived by the gun. He died by the gun. This next article details the impact the event had on his brother, who was photographed in tears. It was reported that shortly after this photo was taken, he went to meet with Frank Costello. The two men, once giants in the underworld, were seen embracing each other, both in tears. This moment highlighted how even the toughest mob boss, Frank Costello, had become a shadow of his former self. In the 1920s and 30s, Costello was a force to be reckoned with, commanding the streets with authority. He was a political kingmaker, a true boss, and a powerhouse who had taken down many. But this new generation of mobsters had taken what they learned from the old guard and become even more ruthless. Although Frank still had significant support, he was ready to step back. This article, published on October 26th, captures that transition. Grieves for brother, Anthony Tough Tony Anastasia, waterfront labor boss, appears grief-stricken as he leaves a midtown Manhattan hotel where his brother, Underworld chieftain Albert Anastasia, was shot to death Friday. Police said countless Underworld figures had scores to settle with Albert Anastasia. The question is who got there first. For 36 of his 55 years, Albert had plotted gang killings or had seen to them himself. Those aware said Anastasia was murdered because he ordered the shooting of gambling czar Frank Costello in May. With the bungling of that assassination attempt, the same Underworld intimates said Anastasia knew his own life was forfeit. Anastasia also dreaded that his wife and his son might be killed. A friend said Anastasia ordered Costello killed because Costello was seeking a bigger share of the profits from the policy racket and big-time dice games that Anastasia was running. And, said the same source, Anastasia increased the number of his own bodyguards and put guards over his wife and son after Costello escaped with a scalp wound when shot in the foyer of his apartment house in Manhattan. The source said he met Anastasia at the Jamaica racetrack only last Saturday. "You look tired, Al," the friend recalled saying. "What's the matter?" Anastasia looked worn, worried, and years older than he had only 6 months earlier, the friend reported. The friend said Anastasia dispiritedly ripped up a handful of $100 tickets on losing horses and said, "I don't care what they do to me, but I am worried about my family." "What do you mean?" the friend asked. Forget about it, Anastasia replied, then walked away. The police threw guards around all persons they had questioned in the Anastasia murder, the barbershop crew, the elevator boy, men and women who might have brushed shoulders with the fleeing gunman as they left. The dead man's relatives were guarded too, against their wishes, among them Anthony, Tough Tony, Anastasia, Albert's 50-year-old brother, who is a vice president of the International Longshoremen's Association and business manager for Local 1814 of that organization. Police officials said, "We're going to talk to anybody we think will throw any light on this case." Anastasia led a seemingly charmed life until Friday. Authorities believed the wealthy mobster figured in the deaths of 63 victims of the old Murder Incorporated slay-for-pay ring, but they never proved it. Once they got him as far as the Sing Sing death house, but he went free. He was named repeatedly in investigations as a sinister figure behind New York, New Jersey waterfront rackets that milked businesses of millions of dollars a year. But Anastasia would not talk. To do so might tend to incriminate him, he explained. Albert was the oldest, beefiest, and most sinister of 4 Anastasia brothers, identified with extortion, usury, pilfering, wildcat strikes, assault and murder on the New York waterfront. He was believed connected also with strong-arm rackets in the shipping, trucking, laundry and garment industries, as well as in gambling and crooked politics. Between 1921 and 1954, Albert was arrested 10 times, 5 of these for murder. His total penalties were 4 years in prison. Usually he went free as witnesses disappeared or gave weak testimony. His first arrest in 1921 was his most serious. Anastasia and a compatriot were convicted of murdering a longshoreman. For 18 months, they sat in the death cells at Sing Sing until lawyers won a retrial on a technicality. By that time, 4 key prosecution witnesses were missing. The defendants were freed in April 1922. Murder, Incorporated, was exposed in 1940. Abe Relis, a gunman for the syndicate, to save his life, told police Anastasia was the chief executioner. 3 gunmen for the mob died in the electric chair. But Relis mysteriously fell to his death in 1941 from an 8th-floor window of the Half Moon Hotel, Coney Island. William O'Dwyer, then Brooklyn District Attorney, said his perfect case against Anastasia had collapsed. The Kings County Grand Jury in 1945 censured O'Dwyer nevertheless for not prosecuting Anastasia. However, O'Dwyer was elected mayor in 1945 on the strength of his prosecution of Murder Incorporated. From 1942 to 1944, Anastasia hid in the Army as a longshore training GI sergeant in Pennsylvania. After his discharge, he got citizenship under a wartime law favoring servicemen. After the war, he purchased a dress factory. He lived in a $75,000 yellow stucco house overlooking the Hudson River in Fort Lee, New Jersey. There he lived behind a fence and guarded by a chauffeur and 2 watchdogs. With his family and Albert, Senior Anastasia refused on the grounds of self-incrimination to tell either the Senate Crime Investigating Committee in 1951 or the New York State Crime Commission in 1952 how he made a living. He refused to tell them virtually anything else either. The federal government began deportation proceedings against him in 1953. Courts ruled against the government, and the case was dropped in 1956. The Senate Rackets Investigating Committee said Friday that Anastasia would have been one of the witnesses in its investigations of labor racketeering in New York. Slaying scene police cars block the mid-Manhattan intersection of West 55th Street and 7th Avenue, near the entrance to the barbershop through which gunmen passed on their way to slay Anastasia. This view of the busy area was made from the southeast corner of 7th Ave, looking west into 55th Street, Associated Press wire photo, Moretti first. Friends go same way. Hackensack, New Jersey, UP. If Willie Moretti could do it, he would be crowing a bit today. They sent 4 men to mow down the talkative chummy Willie 6 years ago. It took only 2 to take the silent executioner, Albert Anastasia. The lives and deaths of Albert and Willie were remarkably alike. They traveled in the same underworld circles. Their families were well acquainted. They got questioned by the same investigators. They lived within a few miles of each other in New Jersey. They died by the same type of violence. Anastasia was one of the first to be questioned after 4 gunmen joked in Italian over coffee with Moretti in Joe's Elbow Room, a restaurant and bar in Cliffside Park, New Jersey, and then ended his life with a fusillade of bullets. That was at 10:28 in the morning, on October 4th, 1951, 6 years and 21 days before 2 triggermen did the same thing to Anastasia in a New York hotel barber chair. In New Jersey, Bergen County Police still are looking for Moretti's killers. Anastasia, who lived in nearby Fort Lee, New Jersey, showed up here at the county prosecutor's office that evening. He told police sadly he knew no reason Moretti would be murdered, or who would do such a thing. Police had their own ideas. A police spokesman said of the gunmen, "They knew their job well. It was obviously a professional job, and they didn't want to have any blundering as they did in the Costello shooting." He was referring to the wounding of gambler Frank Costello, longtime kingpin of the New York Underworld, whose skull was nicked with a bullet last May 2nd as he entered the foyer of his Central Park West apartment home. Police officials said Friday night, "We're going to talk to anybody we think will throw light on this case. You can assume that all witnesses to the Anastasia shooting are being protected." Among those questioned last night and early today was Anthony Coppola, 49, Anastasia's bodyguard and chauffeur. Coppola said he was at his home in Fairview, New Jersey, when he learned Anastasia was killed. Coppola, who surrendered himself for questioning, was quoted as saying he picked up Anastasia's car at 11 in the morning, 40 minutes after Anastasia was murdered, in a parking lot not far from the Park Sheraton, and drove it to his New Jersey home. Coppola said Anastasia had put the car in the lot at 8 in the morning. Coppola said the car, registered in his name, then was driven by his sister to a lot opposite 100 Center Street, the criminal courts building and city prison, where it was located by police Friday night. There was no explanation of why the bodyguard was not with Anastasia during the morning. After Coppola left the West 54th Street police station at 5:30 in the morning, Chief of Detectives James B. Leggett said Coppola lied about his activities Friday morning. Leggett said Coppola admitted approaching the Park Sheraton to meet Anastasia minutes after the shooting, learned what happened, and left. The chief said Coppola drove to his Fairview home and then had the car driven to the downtown parking lot where it was found Friday night. Leggett said more than 60 people had been questioned, but nobody was talking. All the Anastasia brothers could not be called Valiant New York, AP. Albert Anastasia came from a family of 9 brothers and 3 sisters. 3 brothers, like Anastasia, have been involved with the police. Another is a parish priest. The brothers Anastasia was born in Tropea, a little fishing village on the tip of southern Italy. Of the children, 2 girls and 1 boy died at an early age. 1 brother remained in Italy as a railroad worker, and another brother emigrated to Australia. Of Albert's 5 brothers who came to the United States, Anthony, Tough Tony, 51, the strong-arm boss of the Brooklyn waterfront, ranks next to Albert in unproved charges of murder, assault, and other crimes. Joseph, who retained the old family spelling of a terminal O on the last name, at various times was involved in murder, bookmaking, and waterfront thievery. He died last year at the age of 51. Jerry, or Gerardo, 43, has only a minor record of bookmaking and 1 withdrawn charge of attacking pickets. Frank, the youngest brother, lives a quiet life as a Brooklyn longshoreman. Salvatore, 36, is a Roman Catholic priest. The shooting of Anastasia was one of the most breathtaking events in organized crime history, taking place during a time of momentous change. The Mafia, ever opportunistic, capitalized on these changes, whether it was during the Second World War when Lucky Luciano and his outfit formed a relationship with U.S. naval intelligence to aid in the invasion of Sicily, or in the following years when they forged alliances with the OSS, the precursor to the Central Intelligence Agency. The Mafia worked closely with the CIA during the 1950s to exert control not just in the United States, but also across Europe. As European empires collapsed, the American empire rose, with the Sicilian Mafia playing a crucial role in expanding influence. The Mafia and the CIA sought to control parts of South America, Africa, Asia, and South Asia, using organized crime to stem the spread of communism. In the 1950s, when the CIA was gaining power under Allen Dulles, a close friend of President Harry S. Truman, the Mafia's influence grew significantly. Truman himself had ties to the Southern Mafia through figures like Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky, who sent them to Carlos Marcello and the New Orleans Mafia, who'd taken control of the entire South alongside the Trafficante family. Presidents Eisenhower and Nixon were also connected to the world of organized crime. By this time, the Mafia's control extended into politics and unions, with their influence spreading globally. In the 1940s, the Mafia's influence had even seeped into the FBI, including corrupting its head, J. Edgar Hoover. An interesting tidbit of history reveals just how deep these connections ran. The Mafia was well aware of Hoover's private preferences. Hoover, for his part, maintained a relationship with Meyer Lansky's close friend, Louis Rosenstiel, and his wife Susan during Prohibition. Years later, Susan Rosenstiel spoke openly about her experiences, including one particularly revealing incident. "I discovered early in our marriage that my husband was bisexual," Susan recalled in an interview. "He was involved with Roy Cohn, the assistant counsel to Senator McCarthy, who used to visit with a little boyfriend. They would, squeeze each other, and it became clear to me that he was a gay boy." One day Rosenstiel said, "We're going to the Plaza Hotel this evening, and Roy Cohn will be there. You will be incredibly surprised by what you'll see." I didn't have much to say, so I agreed to go. When they arrived at the plaza, Rosenstiel insisted on entering through a side door. We went up in the elevator, either to the second or third floor, and there was a sign on the door that read, "Do not disturb." We knocked, and Roy Cohn opened the door. We went in, and there was a gentleman dressed as a woman. Roy introduced me, saying, "I'd like you to meet Mary." But I knew the name was not Mary, because the person looked just like J. Edgar Hoover. In fact, it was clearly J. Edgar Hoover. He was solidly built, had a little stubble, and was dressed in a short black chiffon dress with ruffles, black lace stockings, high heels, a black curly wig, and black false eyelashes. He was sitting with his legs crossed. The interviewer interrupted, asking, "Now, wait a minute. You're saying it looked like J. Edgar Hoover, or are you certain it was him?" "It was clearly J. Edgar Hoover," Susan replied categorically. "Do you have any doubt at all about that?" the interviewer pressed. "Absolutely not," she responded without hesitation. However, on November 14, 1957, just 3 weeks after the death of Anastasia, an event occurred that even J. Edgar Hoover, who had been aligned with organized crime since the 1940s, could not ignore. That was the meeting at Joe Barbera's estate. Many mobsters were arrested at that meeting, which quickly became known as a mob convention. While the exact number of arrests has often varied in reports, the information I am sharing is as fresh as it gets, as it was released the very next day. The meeting, rooted in the East and orchestrated by Vito Genovese and other powerful mobsters, led to the arrest of about 64 individuals, though most headlines at the time reported the number as 62. A mob convention is routed in East Vito Genovese racketeer, and 64 henchmen are arrested at Apalachin, New York, maybe Anastasia link. But all insist they were visiting sick friend and are released. Apalachin, New York, November 15, AP. State police declared it was a national gangland convention, but the 65 men in attendance, many of them convicted criminals, insisted they were just visiting a sick friend. Police wondered whether a new gang war was in the making. "Just visiting a sick man," was their reply. Vito Genovese is their troopers, aided by U.S. Treasury agents, sent them packing yesterday. This normally peaceful south-central New York community, near the Pennsylvania line, did not care for such visitors as mobster Vito Genovese and his friends, even though they had plenty of cash. Troopers rounded up the 65 men at the imposing stone mansion of Joseph Barbara, who runs a bottling works in nearby Endicott. The mansion sits atop a wooded hill near here. All the men were released after identifying themselves, but further investigation is underway. "We haven't a thing on them," said Sergeant Edgar Croswell of the State Police Bureau of Criminal Investigation. "But we made it clear we wanted them out of the area." Just a coincidence. "All had one story," Croswell said. Mr. Barbara had been sick, and we all came to see him. They all just happened to quickly visit at the same time. The 51-year-old Barbara told a reporter he had suffered several heart attacks this year, and it was good to see my friends. The visitors, police said, included dope peddlers, bookmakers, burglars, extortionists, bootleggers, narcotic pushers, and assorted racketeers. There also were a few who seemed to be legitimate businessmen. Police said each man had at least $450 in cash, and one had $10,000. No guns were found, however. The visitors came from New York, New Jersey, Ohio, California, Texas, Colorado, Pennsylvania, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. Speculation about the purpose of the meeting ran rife. Could the men have been discussing the current U.S. Senate probe of garbage-hauling rackets, the recent shooting of Albert Anastasia, or the planned demise of some other racketeer? Split Anastasia stock. The New York World Telegram and Sun reported that one of the items of business was the redistribution of several rackets in which Anastasia was a major stockholder. His interests were to be split up among other powerful gang chieftains, the newspaper said. The men began filtering into the area on Wednesday, police said. Troopers became suspicious when they saw large numbers of expensive motor cars, many with out-of-state license plates, parked at motels. Tourists' travel normally is not heavy here in November. Croswell said police set up roadblocks and surrounded the house on the hill before the men started to break for it. 13 were picked up in a field, and the others at the roadblocks. Vito Genovese, 59, of Atlantic Highlands, New Jersey, once was described by Thomas E. Dewey, former governor, as King of the Rackets. His name has been mentioned in connection with the gangland slaying of Anastasia in a New York City barber chair last month. The day after the notorious mob convention, another article was printed, releasing the full list of names of those who were present. The list was obtained from police officers and caused even more turmoil, as it revealed exactly who was arrested. While we know who was there, and who was taken into custody, several mobsters managed to escape. The list of those captured included prominent figures like Santo Traficante Jr., who ruled over Florida, and Joseph Civello, the underboss of Dallas. The real boss of Texas, Carlos Marcello, was so powerful he did not need to attend meetings. Marcello skipped this one out of respect for Frank Costello. While some mobsters managed to escape, others were not so lucky. The younger members were quick to run and find shelter, but many of the older statesmen, like Carlo Gambino, were too old to flee. Interestingly, most of the young ones who were arrested were residents of the property where the meeting took place. Here is the article detailing the events. State Police List. Men who attended Barbera meeting, son of host. Present at Binghamton session, names of 9 others were not recorded. Binghamton, New York, November 15th, AP. State Police. Today, issued this list of men who attended Thursday's meeting. Names of 9 others were not recorded. Those from the Buffalo area are in a separate list. Anthony Guy Guaricri, 47, Endwell, operates a dress factory. Patsy Pasquale Turigiano, 51, Endicott, grocery clerk. He said he had been convicted in 1950 for the illegal operation of a still. Ignatius Cannon, 32, Endwell, owns a restaurant. Bartolo Guccia, 66, Endicott, operates a small fish store. Joseph Barbera Jr., 21, Apalachin, son of Joseph Barbera, the host. Emmanuel Ziccardi, 57, Endicott, shoe worker. Simonis Gozzari, 57, San Gabriel, California, alien giving his home as Palermo, Sicily. Frank Zito, 64, Springfield, Illinois. Costenze P. Valenti, 31, Rochester, in the wholesale produce business. Frank J. Valenti, 46, Rochester, brother of Costenze P. Valenti, and his partner in the wholesale produce business. Louis A. Larasso, 31, Linden, New Jersey, construction labor foreman. Carmine Lombardizzi, 44, Brooklyn, offices in a trading corporation. Frank Majuri, 47, Elizabeth, New Jersey, construction worker. Michelle A. Miranda, also known as Mike Miranda, 61, Forest Hills, Long Island, auto salesman. James Ostico, 44, Pittston, Pennsylvania, transportation manager. Joseph Civello, 55, Dallas, Texas, importer of food and liquor. Frank Desimoni, 48, Downey, California, attorney. Joseph Bonanno, 52, Brooklyn, retired. John Bonventre, 54, Brooklyn. James Coletti, 60, Pueblo, Colorado. Charles Thierry, 59, Palisades, New Jersey, transportation worker. Paul C. Castellano, 45, Brooklyn, butcher. Russell Buffalino, 54, Kingston, Pennsylvania, drapery man. Gerardo V. Orange, New Jersey, pony owner. Dominic Olivetto, 50, Camden, New Jersey. Joseph Ida, Highland Park, New Jersey, has an auto garage. Joseph Profaci, 60, Brooklyn, owns a distributing firm. Joseph Magliocco, 59, East Islip, Long Island. Salvatore Falcone, Utica. Angelo Chiandra, 33, Pittston, Pennsylvania, orchestra leader. Patsy Sciortino, 42, Auburn, makes bleach for dry cleaners. Rosario Mancuso, 50, Utica, in the concrete business. Sam Monachino, 63, Auburn, in the beer business. Patsy Monachino, 50, Auburn, operates a beverage company. Salvatore Tornabe, 61, New York City, beer salesman. Joseph Rosato, 53, Union City. Luis Santo, 42, Havana, Cuba, operates Sanssouci nightclub, also known as Santo Traficante Jr. Anthony P. Riala, 61, West Orange, New Jersey, owns a motel. John Scalish, 45, Cleveland, in the cigarette business, told police he had served 5 years in the Ohio State Penitentiary after a conviction on a blackmail charge. John A. DeMarco, 54, Shaker Heights, Ohio, in real estate. Frank Cucchiara, 62, Boston, Massachusetts, cheese manufacturer. Natale J. Evola, 50, Brooklyn, in the garment delivery business. Joseph Falcone, 55, Utica, operates a liquor store. Carlo Gambino, 55, Brooklyn, works in labor relations office. Michael J. Genovese, 38, Gibsonia, Pennsylvania, operates a car wash business. Gabriel Kelly Manarino, 42, New Kensington, Pennsylvania, owns a junkyard. Vincent Rao, 59, Yonkers, real estate man. Armand Rava, 46, Brooklyn, owns a restaurant. Joseph Riccobono, 53, Staten Island. Joseph Barbera Sr., 51, Brooklyn, the host. Vito Genovese, alleged kingpin of Mafia, John Montana, president of the Van Dyke Taxi Company, told the News Today that he was at the Barbera home where police say an Eastern syndicate was meeting, but due to unforeseen circumstances and not by plan. I was in that area and I had car trouble, he said. While the car was being repaired, I called on him, Barbera, for many years. I met him when I was in the beer business. It was nothing social, just a call. Those people, the 64 men questioned by police, are strangers to me. I am not personally acquainted with a single one of them. In fact, I was not in the same room with them while I was in that home. I have nothing to hide, nothing to conceal, Mr. Montana said. I can talk to the FBI, the tax people, and anyone else in authority because I have not committed a crime. The state troopers were wonderful to me, he continued. They were courteous, and of course I told them everything they wanted to know about me. I'm prepared to take an oath, he said, that I do not know any of the men listed as having been questioned by the police. I do not know Vito Genovese or what he looks like. Mr. Montana said he returned from his trip to the Binghamton area late Thursday, and that since that time he has been confined to his home with a cold. After 50 years as a law-abiding citizen, he said, I'm disgusted and hurt at the insinuations contained in the story. Men questioned claimed they were sick of business. Kingpin of the Mafia among 65 at Binghamton, New York, November 15th, UP. State police said today the list of those questioned after a steak barbecue Thursday at the home of Joseph Barbera of Endicott included the following Western New Yorkers. Sam Lagatuta, 58, Buffalo, a house painter. James V. LaDuca, 45, Lewiston, Secretary-Treasurer of the Hotel and Restaurant Workers Union, Buffalo. John Montana, 64, Buffalo, President of the Van Dyke Taxi Company. Roy Carlisi, 48, Buffalo, owner of the Club 97 restaurant. Antonio Magadino, 60, Niagara Falls, a mortician. Dominic D'Agostino, 66, Niagara Falls, unemployed with a record of arrest for narcotics violation. Reported agenda. Given the New York World Telegram and Sun said one of the main items of business was the redistribution of several rackets in which slain gangster Albert Anastasia was a major stockholder. His interests were to be split up among other powerful gang chieftains, the newspaper said. These rackets reportedly included multi-million-dollar coin machine operations ranging from slot and pinball machines to vending and washing machines. The newspaper said New York's garbage disposal rackets, now being probed by the Special Senate Rackets Committee, also appeared to be on the agenda. Troopers conceded they moved in on the powwow Thursday to keep the group off balance and show, "We don't want them around here." Some in legitimate business. Some of those seized boast long criminal records, but others were engaged in legitimate businesses, according to authorities. Sergeant Edgar Croswell of the Vestal State Police Barracks termed the whole crowd uncooperative under questioning. All were turned loose, he said, because there was no indication of a crime and no charges against them. "We haven't a thing on them," said Sergeant Croswell. "But we made it clear we wanted them out of the area." Sergeant Croswell said the group included a good cross-section of the nation's hoodlums. He said several such meetings had been held in this area in recent years. The last one of comparable size was in November 1956, he added. Genovese, best known Genovese, had been questioned in the recent Underworld slaying of murder incanter executioner Anastasia. Genovese, who lives in Atlantic Highlands, New Jersey, was the best recognized name among the flock picked up, but authorities indicated they believed some much higher figures in the syndicate with less well-known names were in the crowd. The conventioneers had flowed into Apalachin from all over: New York, New Jersey, Ohio, Illinois, California, Texas, Colorado, Florida, and even Cuba and Puerto Rico. The size of their bankrolls ranged all the way from $500 to $10,000. Tax agents arrived. Police became suspicious Wednesday when luxury cars began converging on the expensive home of Joseph Barbera, head of an Endicott, New York beverage distributing firm, who was beaten 4 indictments for murder. More limousines moved in Thursday. About 1 p.m., Sergeant Croswell said 2 tax agents and 15 police officers drove up the hill in a caravan. They were plainly seen by the men who were relaxing around Barbera's barbecue pit over the remains of a steak lunch. Then the police began copying down license numbers. This broke up the party. Police set up a roadblock at the bottom of the hill, and the trap was down within an hour. Dozen break-and-run 12 of the men broke into nearby woods, but were quickly rounded up. All were taken to the Vestal barracks for questioning, and released one at a time. Sergeant Croswell said they all had just one story. Mr. Barbera had been sick. We all came to see him. We just happened to drop in at the same time. Authorities indicated they believed they broke up a policy-making convention of the Eastern Seaboard Syndicate. Barbera, reached by telephone at his $100,000 hilltop home, said he would been under a doctor's care for 8 months since I had a heart attack. "It was good to see my friends," he said. "I doubt if they'll be back to this area after the rough time we gave them," Sergeant Croswell said. "If they do come back, they'll get the same treatment." Can't talk too long. Barbera was asked how come his friends all made their sick calls together. "My doctor said I can't talk too long," he said politely before hanging up. In addition to Genovese, boss of a dozen rackets, and said to be so high in crime that he gives orders to Frank Costello. The visiting hoodlums included Joseph Profazzi of Brooklyn, reputed to be an elder statesman of the Italian Mafia, or Black Hand Society. Vincent Rao of Yonkers, another long-reputed top gangster. And Luis Santo, also known as Santo Traficante of Havana, who told police he was manager of the Sans Souci Hotel there, and had just flown up for the day. Police made public the names of 56 of those questioned. They said the other 9 questioned were merely lackeys or local boys or chauffeurs. Many people, including numerous Mafia channels on YouTube, have claimed that the infamous raid on the meeting happened because someone snitched. I can assure you that is not true. It was not Luciano in Italy who tipped off authorities, and it certainly was not Frank Costello. At that time, the Mafia had infiltrated and corrupted almost every part of America, and they would have discovered exactly how the information reached local law enforcement if a leak had occurred. The truth is, crime was already being exposed layer by layer, especially in the 1950s with the emergence of television. The Kefauver hearings played a significant role in making these men famous as gangsters, and nothing could change that image. The Mafia had managed to corrupt local law enforcement, including the heads of FBI agencies and even J. Edgar Hoover himself. However, there were still weaknesses in their power. Evil only prevails when good men do nothing, and for a long time, good men were doing nothing. But on that occasion, during that meeting, a good man did something. He reported what he saw, and that spurred others to act. What followed would go down in history. Edgar Croswell exposed one of the darkest power structures in American history, proving to Americans and the world that an organized crime group existed, one powerful enough to control various parts of the government and the country. Their influence was not just limited to America, it came from abroad as well. The fallout from this event was catastrophic. Frank Costello was already dealing with tax issues and was behind bars when it happened. Meanwhile, Charlie Luciano was in Sicily, Italy. When he heard the news, he was furious. Luciano, who suffered from stomach issues, had been feeling better that day and had gone to a restaurant with a few friends. It was during this meal that one of his associates rushed in to inform him of the disaster. Luciano immediately left, went home, and overwhelmed by shock, vomited up his meal before sinking to the floor in disbelief. The empire he had built and kept secret had been exposed in one swift blow. Luciano lamented that in earlier days, meetings were held only in places completely under their control. The Atlantic City Convention was in a location controlled through Nucky Johnson. The Chicago Convention was managed by Al Capone and the Chicago outfit, including Tony Accardo. When these men got together to rig Franklin D. Roosevelt's election, it was also in Chicago, where they had significant control. Other meetings were conducted in complete secrecy, but major gatherings were always in places they controlled. The 1946 Havana Convention, for instance, was held in a country these men dominated. Meetings were never to be conducted after a major event due to the increased scrutiny, but Vito Genovese ignored that rule. Just 3 weeks after Anastasia's assassination, he began organizing a major convention. Many attendees were reluctant, fearing they might be murdered upon arrival. Some even reached out to Luciano, informing him of the planned meeting. Luciano, who had not sanctioned the gathering, warned them to be cautious. The meeting was orchestrated by Russell Bufalino, Joe Barbera, and several others, and it was to be held at Barbera's property. Vito Genovese, along with Russell Bufalino, was arrested, and soon after came the Senate and committee hearings. These hearings propelled 2 more powerful politicians into the spotlight: Jack F. Kennedy and his brother Robert F. Kennedy, a lawyer at the time. Jack would become president within the next 3 years, and Robert would assume the role of Attorney General shortly after. Luciano was furious with Vito Genovese and wanted to eliminate him, but he realized that killing Vito could mean death for either him or his family members, something he was not willing to risk. Luciano also found himself increasingly isolated, unsure of who to trust back in America. Many of the old guard, like Albert Anastasia, had been killed, and others who had risen to power during his era were now dead. The new generation of gangsters, men like Carlo Gambino, Tony Accardo, Sam Giancana, Santo Trafficante, and others, like Vito Genovese, were feared, not the mobsters who had been deported. This situation sent a clear message. If you were deported, you would lose your power, influence, and control. It became evident that staying close to America was crucial to maintaining relevance and authority in the underworld. This realization led many mobsters to grapple with the issue of how to remain influential while being physically removed from the center of power. Joe Adonis, like others, had to confront this harsh reality, understanding that distance from America often meant the end of their reign. Luciano was a pioneer in organized crime, and even though he may have been losing some control, he remained deeply respected in the Sicilian underworld. His authority was unquestioned, both by the local mafia in Sicily and by high-ranking Sicilian mafia members. Carlo Gambino, who had ambitions to take over New York, understood this well. He knew that most of his family was still in Palermo, Italy. So, maintaining a good relationship with Luciano and the Sicilian mafia was essential for him. This is why communication between the Gambinos and the Lucianos was frequent during that period. One key message Gambino received was that his task was to frame Vito Genovese. Luciano wanted Vito behind bars, while Frank Costello wanted Vincent, the Chin Gigante, to be punished for the attempted hit on him. Additionally, Gambino aimed to imprison Carmine Galante to weaken Joe Bonanno's power. These goals set the stage for two significant fronts. One against the Washington establishment, which would eventually lead to one of organized crime's biggest mistakes, backing the Kennedy family, and the second, a focused effort to put Vito Genovese behind bars. Luciano demanded that Gambino work to frame Vito on narcotics charges, which would ultimately lead to the revelations brought forward by Joe Valachi. The initial attempt was a failure, but Luciano was furious, and Gambino promised him that he would eventually take down all three targets. Before his imprisonment, Genovese had given numerous interviews, often flanked by his lawyer, denying everything with a cold, calculated demeanor. But in 1958, he offered a rare glimpse into his world to two Australian journalists. This brief but revealing interview was published in the Sydney Morning Herald on Sunday, November 23, 1958, on page 18. It was a stark contrast to the more extensive interviews given by his contemporaries. Frank Costello had graced the front page of Time magazine in 1949, and both Charlie Luciano and Meyer Lansky had shared their stories in interviews and books, offering a glimpse into the murky world of prohibition, union corruption, and the political machinations of the 1950s. Genovese's 1958 interview stands as a rare artifact, a fleeting insight into the mind of one of the most powerful and enigmatic figures in organized crime. It was a moment of revelation before the walls of his empire began to crumble, setting the stage for the downfall of a man who had once been untouchable. Two reporters this week looked into the home life of America's most powerful and best-known gangster. They found that Vito Genovese, the gangster in question, lives in a small weatherboard cottage, which he rents for $100 a month. "Good morning, gentlemen," the gangster welcomed them. Then he explained, "I am very fussy about food, so I do all my own cooking." The reporters were disillusioned by Genovese's surroundings because he was reported to be living in a $40,000 mansion. Instead, they found him in a simply furnished cottage. There was no guard at the house, nor was there a gun in sight. Genovese, known as Mr. Mafia, and king of the rackets, is alleged to have $22 million in European banks. The two reporters who visited him in his home in Atlantic Highlands, New Jersey, found him in his kitchen, wearing an apron and making chicken cacciatore for lunch. Genovese showed the reporters his wardrobe. It consisted of 5 suits, the last of which was bought 2 years ago, a dozen shirts, and 3 pairs of shoes. Genovese is set to go on trial in a fortnight as the alleged head of an international drug combine. He would not commit himself on the trial, saying, "Gentlemen, it's not that I refuse to answer any questions. I will answer them in detail after the trial. In fact, I will call you fellows." It was Genovese's estranged wife who claimed he hid $32 million in Europe. Was she right? The reporter asked. "Women, women, women," said the bespectacled gangster. "What are we going to do with them, gentlemen? This woman lived with me for 20 years. Then she put the blast on me. That is when all my trouble began. She made up a lot of stories about me owning dog tracks, race tracks, power plants in Italy, nightclubs, the Italian lottery, and putting money in safe deposit boxes in Switzerland. Genovese has also been accused of being decorated during World War II by Mussolini, while he was wanted for murder. "I had no relationship with Mussolini," Genovese said indignantly. "I never saw Mussolini except in pictures."